Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's presentation by Kevin Washburn, UI Dean of Law, former Assistant Secretary of Indian Affairs at the United States Department of Interior and under President Obama, who will speak to us today on serving as Secretary of State to America's tribal nations. I am Sandra Morrow, ICFRC board member and host for today's program. We would like to take a moment to thank our members, volunteers, and interns for making these forums possible. I also want to acknowledge our university and community supporters, the University of Iowa's Honors Program, the University of Iowa Public Policy Center, University of Iowa International Programs, and the Stanley UI Foundation Support Organization for their financial support. And I thank today's special sponsor, an anonymous donation in honor of Ed Zastro. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Kevin Washburn. Kevin Washburn joined Iowa Law as its 18th dean on June 15th, 2018. Most recently, he was a Regents Professor of Law at the University of New Mexico School of Law and had served as its dean from June 2009 to October 2012, when he was appointed by President Obama and confirmed by the Senate to be the Assistant Secretary of Indian Affairs at the U.S. Department of the Interior. He served in that role until January of 2016. Washburn is a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation of Oklahoma. He earned a BA from the University of Oklahoma and a JD from Yale Law School. Prior to entering academia, he clerked for a judge on the Ninth Circuit and worked as a trial attorney and then as prosecutor with the U.S. Department of Justice, and served as the general counsel of the National Indian Gaming Commission. As an academic, he has held faculty positions in Minnesota and Arizona and taught for a year as a visitor at Harvard. Washburn's teaching experience includes criminal law, contracts, property, and constitutional law, federal jurisdiction, and administrative law. He has taught and published casebooks in specialty subjects, primarily in the law of gaming and federal Indian law. Please join me in welcoming Kevin Washburn.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real honor to be here today. I'm going to do three things this afternoon. I'm going to talk a little bit about Indian tribes. I'm going to talk a little bit about President Obama and his legacy in Indian country and my work for him. And then, since this is the Council on Foreign Relations, I'm going to talk a little bit about time I spent at the United Nations in Geneva representing the United States when I was working for President Obama. There's a lot that isn't known about Indian tribes generally, so I'm just going to do a little bit of intro to that, to Indian country for all of you. So in 1491, we don't know for sure, but the estimates are that there were as many as 10 million Native Americans in the United States, speaking what is now the United States, North America at any rate, speaking 300 or more different languages. And they were organized into many, many different communities, hundreds of different communities, maybe thousands. And they ranged from bands of dozens or hundreds of people to cities of thousands of people. They did live in cities, some of them, even in the 15th century and before. Descendants of most of those communities still exist. Some of them are gone, but many of them still exist. The diversity is incredible. I like to say that, you Iowans are more similar to Texans or Oregonians or, people from Massachusetts than the average Alaska Native member is to someone in Florida or, on the eastern seaboard or even Southern California. Tribes are everywhere, and they're very different from one another. They have different diets, they have different lifestyles, and they just differ far more than, Americans in different places differ from one another. Many of them still practice a lot of their original culture. The sense is, we have this myth of conquest in the United States, that the West was won. And that's not really true. Most tribal peoples were neither conquered militarily, nor were they intentionally exterminated, although a lot of them did die, largely from diseases that the Europeans brought to the United States. So they died, but it wasn't necessarily purposeful. Mostly, Indian tribes lost their land through treaties, right? Negotiations. They sold their lands in many respects. And the word reservation, when you think of an Indian reservation, that's kind of a real estate term, right? We've reserved this land while we ceded a lot of other land. That's what it means. That's what a reservation is. It's a reservation of rights in land. Now, many of those treaties were broken, and so, the big lie about how the West was won really ought to be characterized probably about how the United States committed fraud against Indian tribes, because it made promises and then failed to live up to them. And they induced tribes to give up property, and never, and the tribes were often not fully paid, although they were paid in some respects, and they still are being paid today. And I'll talk about that in a moment. There's, all of the West and all of the United States originally at one point was occupied by Indian tribes. But here's the pattern since 1850, what things looked like, and in the upper left-hand corner is what things looked like in 1850, and then the lower right corner is 1990. Most of the land is gone, and here's what it looks like today. Indian land in the United States, it's still a significant amount of land that tribes have, mostly in the West. There are 574 American Indian tribal nations. You see, it's not fair to characterize them as postage stamps because some of them are large, but they're sort of stamps, postage stamps all over the map there. It totals about 60 million acres. And on those lands, tribes are sovereign. And that means they have governmental power in many respects, if not in absolute complete respect. Today's tribes are living in, the hottest places in North America and the coldest places in North America, it turns out. And those deserts are getting hotter, and those cold places are melting. And so tribes are especially vulnerable to climate change, more vulnerable than any other Americans, just because of the places where they live. And that's becoming a real problem for many of them, and some of them are going to be needed to be relocated. They've moved over time to some degree already, but there's some desperation that's going to be coming. 70% of tribes now live in urban areas, and I've set forth on this slide the number of where they're located. In gross numbers, it's in big cities. They're in the biggest cities in the country, but the cities with the highest percentage of natives are Anchorage, Tulsa, Albuquerque, and Oklahoma City. So they're located in smaller cities as well. But 30% presumably are still on reservations around the United States. And there are, in total, 2.9 million people in the last census that claimed that they were American Indian or Alaska Native. There were 6.6 million who claimed that along with some other race. So there is a large representation of American Indian people still in the United States. Not so many in Iowa, as you can see. Now, what does it mean when I say someone is an American Indian or a Native American? There's real debate in the courts right now about what that means. Tribes tend not to characterize that as a racial classification generally, but as a political classification. So when someone says, when I say I'm Chickasaw, that means politically I'm a member of the Chickasaw Nation of Oklahoma. And I can vote in elections, so it's a political classification. It's, in some ways a racial classification too. There are certainly people who are Native American ethnically but are not a member of any tribe. So in that sense, it's a racial classification. Some Indians are cute. Some of them look more like me. Apologies about that. Their identities may be obvious, though, or they may not, right? You wouldn't know if you saw me walking down the street. You'd say, who's that bald white guy? You wouldn't necessarily say, oh, there's a Native American, right? And so, Many of them don't outwardly look Native American, but they are a tribal citizen like me. American citizenship, tribes like to say, was, they say they're, I've got a friend that says that his tribal membership was bestowed by God. His American citizenship was bestowed against our will by the American government. So all American Indians are American citizens, but that hasn't always been the case. And it was only in 1924 that all American Indians were made citizens of the United States by act of Congress. Some of them had negotiated it in treaties before that time, but it was only in 1924. So after, women's suffrage, basically did tribes get a chance to, Native Americans get a chance to vote in the United States. So my role, my area of scholarship was American Indian law, and I will tell you, when you go to law school and you're Native American, the common question you get is, when you graduate, are you going to go help your people? And it seems kind of heartless to say, no, I'm going to Wall Street. So eventually, as you kind of wear down, I wasn't necessarily headed this direction whenever I went to law school, but I kind of realized I don't know why anybody is a tax lawyer, but I definitely know why I do what I do, why I'm, interested in American Indian law. So, sorry, tax lawyers out there. So tribes have a government-to-government relationship with the United States, much like foreign nations have. There are something like 195 countries around the world, right? There are 574 tribes. I used to work a little bit with the State Department. First, it was Secretary Clinton when I arrived in government, and then pretty soon Secretary Kerry took over. And I used to complain because their budget at the State Department, they have 1/3 as many nations they are dealing with, but their budget was something like 10 to 20 times more than my budget was. So I always thought that was kind of unfair. They kind of chuckled when I said that sort of thing. Oh, but let me go back. So this is the President Obama meeting with a bunch of tribal leaders, and that's what tribal leaders look like today. The one across the table, well, that's actually Secretary Sally Jewell sitting across the table from the president, and next to her, towards me, is the chairman of my tribe. He's also bald. I guess it's a Chickasaw trait. But several other tribal leaders. And this is in the Roosevelt Room of the White House, which if you go through that door on the right, go down a little hall, you're in the Oval Office. So it's right there in the West Wing of the White House. And the president had meetings like this quite often. And I served as his Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs, so it was my job to deal with that. This all started, the modern sort of position of tribes really was brought to us by Richard Nixon, actually. Richard Nixon is actually very highly thought of in Indian country because his American Indian policy, his statement on American Indian policy of 1970 really kind of ushered in the modern era. JFK and LBJ were moving in this direction and doing really good things in Indian country, but Nixon went to China, and he actually went to Indian country, too. He famously returned Blue Lake to the Taos Pueblo, which had been wrongfully taken from the Taos Pueblo in northern New Mexico. And this is a picture of Richard Nixon in the bowling alley that hangs in the bowling alley in the White House. There actually is a bowling alley in the White House. There's it's only 2 lanes. It's the Harry S. Truman Bowling Alley, but that was kind of fun. I took my staff over there one day for a party after they'd worked really hard on something, and I saw that great picture of Richard Nixon and put him in a new light for me. He bowled with a tie on, but and he had other foibles as well, but we won't talk about those. So Obama campaigned really hard within Indian country. Indeed, he was adopted by the Crow tribe of Montana and given the name Black Eagle while he was on the campaign trail. And so he won Indian country. He successfully cultivated Indian tribes. You'll recall that he successfully cultivated Iowans as well, and that's partly how he got to the White House. While he was there, he vowed to meet with every tribe every year. And so he started these annual summits in which he invited all the tribal nations to Washington to come to, it was called the White House Tribal Nations Conference. And these conferences turned out to be really important. I wasn't there for the first one. I basically started with the second term. His second term in office, but my wife was there at the first one, and it was interesting to see how they developed over time. The reason these meetings were very, very effective was not so much because a bunch of people got to come to Washington, but in part because at those tribal nations conferences, we would bring in most of the cabinet secretaries, and the president would speak. And it wasn't so important that the president speak; it was that each of the cabinet secretaries had to get up in front of Indian country and basically answer the question, what have you done for me lately? And, this is the president's conference, and so those cabinet secretaries wanted to have something to say. So all year, they would be working on things that served Indian country because they didn't want to show up empty-handed, when the president invited them to the White House Tribal Nations Conference. So it was an amazing thing. The way it worked was it just drove a lot of forward progress at each of the cabinet level agencies that has anything to do with Indian tribes. And they all have a little bit to do with Indian tribes. I was the #1 federal policymaker for Indian tribes directly, but every part of the government is involved with tribes to some degree. One of the funny things that we also held some Native youth conferences, and so that started sort of later in the second term, and the Center for Native Youth at the Aspen Institute helped us organize those things. We brought, I think the first time was 1,200 Native youth to Washington for a similar kind of conference, but not with tribal leaders. It was with Native youth. And the White House came to me and said, the White House staff said, we've got this initiative we want to do. It's called Generation Indigenous. It's going to be called #GenI. Generation Indigenous. And I said, great, what is it? And they said, that's for you to figure out. We've got a great hashtag, though. And so we went to work, and we actually pulled together this really great conference. But again, once again, it was the White House, meeting for tribal youth, and I can't remember what the formal name of it was, but a bunch of the White House staff came over and met with tribal youth. We were trying to get a lot of federal officials there to meet with the tribal youth, and this was the president and actually the First Lady's initiative. She was very involved. Michelle was very involved. And I realized, again, why this was really important and effective as I was sitting next to a guy named Jerry Abramson, and he was the former mayor of Louisville, Kentucky, but he was working in the White House as the director of intergovernmental relations or intergovernmental affairs. And Jerry, he didn't know much about Indian tribes. He was from Kentucky. There aren't today Indian tribes in Kentucky. He hadn't dealt with tribes much before. But a lot of these Native youth, they were college-age kids, mostly, a few high school people, but they would wear their traditional garb, regalia, and they would stand up and often introduce themselves in their native language before they started speaking English. And we were sitting next to we were sitting next to each other on this panel, and it was really not about us speaking; it was about them speaking. So we weren't doing a lot of talking; we were doing a lot of listening. But he leaned over to me and he said, "Gosh, they're all so different. Look how he's dressed and look how she's dressed. They're just completely different than one another." I said, "Yep, Jerry, that's the way it is in Indian country." And a few minutes later, he leaned over to me and he said, "And they're also angry." And I said, "Yeah, that's why they say my job's the hardest job in Washington, because for 200 years, people have been getting angry at the United States for more and more and more. And, finally we're doing something about it, but it doesn't go away immediately." And then he leans over to me like a few minutes later and he said, "What we need is, we need something that will unite all of them together, that they can work together on." And I said, "Well, Jerry, again, that's why, what they have in common is that they're all mad at the United States." So, so they do have that, and this is working. It's a good thing. But it was just funny because, this was a very successful guy in the United States, been mayor of a, not a huge American city, but an important American city, and was now working in the White House, and he just never really thought about these things too much. And this conference forced him to think about it because he wanted to be a good soldier and be over there because the president and the first lady wanted him there, so he was there. And so these conferences, interestingly, were far more important in educating Washington than they were about educating tribal leaders and students. And so it's funny but that's my insight that why those things are important. Certainly, tribes felt respected by them, and that was really important. But the education was going the other direction. So this was, Obama in the first one. He still had black hair in 2009 when he held the first one. And this was in 2016, the last one. I was actually gone from government by then, but they invited me to come back. And this was really just kind of a neat event. They put a blanket around him, and they actually put a cedar hat on his head like they use in the Northwest. He actually took the hat off pretty quickly because if you're not used to them, they look silly. I once said in a Senate hearing to a senator who asked me a question, I said, Senator, I don't know the answer to that question, but the guy over there with the wastebasket on his head, he would have the answer to the question because they look a little bit like wastebaskets or lampshades. But at any rate, this was, Obama was just beloved. And part of the reason he was beloved was the respect that he gave through all those meetings. But part of it was all the things that he did while he was president. And he did just a heck of a lot of things, including restoring a lot of tribal lands, signing a lot of important legislation. This is the Tribal Law and Order Act signing in 2010. This is the Hearth Act in 2012. The Violence Against Women Act reauthorization in 2013, which extended some jurisdiction to tribes that had been taken from them in the past. And all sorts of regulatory reforms. And I'm not going to go through all these because you would be utterly bored. But it is just incredible, the things, the blue ribbon commissions that he put together, and then all the legislative accomplishments that happened, and all the administrative accomplishments, the thing that you can do by rule in a government agency. And most of this is stuff that I worked on in this presentation, but he also appointed the first Native American woman to the federal bench, the federal U.S. District Court in Arizona, and the first Native American ambassador to the UN for human rights. More about him in a few minutes. But he just did so much, and we worked so hard on all these substantive actions. And then, ironically, I got to go with the president in 2015, I think it was August of 2015, to Alaska. And at that time, he announced that he was renaming Mount McKinley to its original name, Denali. And my thought was, what's the big deal? It's just a change of a name. And we'd done all of that work on all those substantive initiatives that actually changed life on the ground, changed the rules that apply to people. But this action actually was far more symbolically important and emotionally important certainly to Alaska Natives than any of the other things that happened. And again, it didn't feel very substantive to me as a lawyer, but I was kind of angry that this got all this attention. This was the National Park Service. They actually kind of handle the naming conventions. There's a commission at the Department of the Interior that does it, but it's kind of more of a Park Service kind of activity. But that was really important to the tribes to have the name restored to the proper name. It turns out President McKinley had never actually even been to Alaska. It was just the non-Indian who discovered Mount McKinley was a McKinley fan, and McKinley was running for election. So they said, we're going to name that one McKinley. And so it didn't make any sense. So even the Plain Dealer, the Cleveland newspaper, came out with an editorial saying, Ohioans are some of them are mad about this because he was our president from Ohio, but it never should have been named Mount McKinley in the first place. The United Nations. Let's turn to the United Nations. Obama signed the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People in this first term. That was before I got there, but that was really important. We were one of the few countries in the world that had not yet signed it, and so Obama said, we're going to do that, and signed it in 2010 or 2011, I believe. But the Obama administration took the UN and the international community and civil society in general very seriously, and our country has not always done that. Sometimes our country has treated the UN like student government or something like that. And Obama didn't do that. He thought that the UN was a place that we really needed to take seriously, and we needed to really participate. And so I ended up going to Geneva a bit. And And why did I go to Geneva? I was the assistant secretary for Indian nations, right? So all my constituents, as it were in the United States. In fact, Chief Justice John Marshall famously characterized them not as foreign nations. He said they're not foreign nations. He characterized them as domestic dependent nations. So it's been, and then it sort of complicated things ever thereafter. They certainly have treaties with the United States, more than 400 treaties that tribes have with the United States. But it turns out that tribes actually go to the United Nations. They go to Geneva, in essence, to put pressure on the United States and to complain. So that's a forum where they can go to sort of get other countries to put pressure on the United States. And when the United States is in Geneva talking about other nations needing to, respect human rights, countries like to wag their finger at the United States and say, yeah, when you start respecting human rights, we'll respect human rights, that kind of thing. And so tribes, there's a well-beaten path from Indian country to the United Nations, in essence. And I've got just a bunch of stories, anecdotes that were kind of helpful to me. The United Nations, like those tribal nations conferences at the White House, we learn from each other. That's one of the reasons the UN is so important. And I learned a lot during my time in Geneva. I went there 3 times. The first time was we had to report on the way, if you probably know this is the Council on Foreign Relations, but the way that these treaties are enforced against countries is largely through a reporting mechanism. Every 5 to 7 years or something like that, each country has to go before a committee of the UN and report how well it's done on any given international covenant. And so the first time I went was on the UN Covenant on the Rights of the Child. We are not parties to that covenant, it turns out. Well, the United States has never signed on to the CRC, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, but we did sign an optional protocol or two, one of them on human trafficking or child trafficking, and so we still got called up to go report. And that was my first time I had been to the UN or to Geneva, and I got to go, and I was very happy to be there. They always like to have someone from my shop that was involved in, Native American issues go, just in case issues came up. And the funny thing was, we'd gotten through the whole meeting, and the tribes just really hadn't worked on those issues with the international ambassadors from other countries that were asking the questions. So there weren't really any Native issues that came up. And I was sort of faced with the fact that I had flown all the way to Geneva for a couple of days, and I was at risk of having sat through an entire day and a half, 2-day hearing without actually having said anything, and I was kind of starting to feel embarrassed about that. But the ambassador, and I think he was from Austria, I can't honestly remember, but I think it was the ambassador from Austria, got up and said, how can you guarantee that the United States is meeting its treaty obligations under even the child trafficking protocol, because the United States doesn't even prosecute this stuff. It's done by individual states within the United States. You need to change your whole form of government to comply with this treaty. And I thought, well, that's naive. That ain't happening. But I sort of signaled the head of the delegation, who was actually one of my former professors, and Harold Coe, and it was his last delegation to the UN because he was stepping down soon thereafter, and it was my first. But I said, can I take this one? And I basically answered the question by, saying, you have no idea, because we've also got 500 plus Indian tribes, and they've all got their own laws, and they aren't necessarily subject to, directly to, the treaty provisions. And so I said, but it works. We generally, these laws do get enforced. I'm a former federal prosecutor, and I've seen these laws enforced, and so it generally works. We've got a really interesting tapestry. It's, the United States isn't a top-down authoritarian type place with one set of laws that apply to everybody. It's got a whole bunch of different sets of laws, but this beautiful tapestry tends to work really well. And so I got to speak at the UN for the first time and give what I thought was was kind of a neat message. And so, at any rate, that was the lesson. But it made me realize that the way we exist isn't necessarily the way other countries exist, and everybody's got a different set of rules and different ways to interpret their own laws. The next time I went back was for the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights. The United States was reporting on its compliance with that treaty. Once again, about every 5 to 7 years, the United States would be called up. All the countries are called up about that often. I will say that the United States delegations to Geneva are bigger than most other countries. We're a wealthy country, but again, it's also a sign that the United States takes this stuff very seriously. So the Japanese ambassador had been lobbied by Indian tribes, and one of the issues at the time was actually a former professor here, Jim Anaya, who is a former law professor at the University of Iowa and is now the dean of the University of Colorado Law School, but he was serving as the special rapporteur for the United Nations for Indigenous Rights. And he had issued a report on the United States. He would go around looking at countries and focusing on how well they treated their indigenous peoples. And he did reports on each of the countries that would serve as fodder for these committee hearings to some degree. And he had done a report, and one of the things he noted was that tribes never really have gotten an apology from the United States. And they kind of have, honestly. My predecessor had apologized. The person who, in the Clinton administration, held my role had famously apologized to Indian tribes on the 175th anniversary of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, but he had apologized largely for the BIA, not for the entire government. And Congress had actually issued a resolution of apology that had passed Congress, and so so Congress had apologized, but there hadn't been an American president that had apologized formally, and so the special rapporteur had written this report saying the United States, the president should apologize, and tribes had gone to the Japanese ambassador and said, "We want you to raise this with the delegation when they're here," and so the Japanese ambassador, raised his hand at the hearing and said, "I have a question for the delegation, and my question is, why doesn't the United States just apologize to the Indian tribes?" And the tone of it was, "Why don't they just apologize and be done with it?" And like it would solve every problem, right? And my sense is, in Japan, an apology it means something far differently than it does in the United States. But I said, I got this one. I wrote, head of delegation. I, waved my hand and said, I'll take this one. Obviously, it's a Native American issue. And so, I said, look, there have been these apologies. I talked about the 2 apologies that there have been. And then I said, and an apology won't end the United States' responsibility to Indian tribes. And then I said, as long as the United States continues to occupy North America, there is going to be duties to the Indian tribes. And thus began my 15 minutes of fame in the Twitterverse. Because the general counsel to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs was sitting 2 people over from me. He was the Department of Defense representative on the delegation, and he had just taken a drink of coffee, and he spewed his coffee, and he turns to the person between us and said, "Did he just say the United States is occupying North America?" We just had gotten the question, how long are you going to occupy Iraq? When are you going to get it out of Iraq? And so so Indian country rejoiced because somebody actually recognized kind of what the truth was here. And I got a little bit of brief fame and had fun with it. That night, so that was the last day of the meeting. And these delegations, they tend to go out for a celebratory dinner and toast each other for being so eloquent in these, in their speeches and answers and stuff. And so I went and got a piece of cardboard and I got a Sharpie and I wrote a sign. I said, put on it, "U.S. out of North America." I'd seen signs like that when I was in college about Central America, and I thought, what the heck? And so I took it and I said, I gave it as a gift to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, said that I pulled this out of a protester outside. But anyway, we had fun together, and he had a good sense of humor about it, and there were a few tweets about it. But the other funny thing that happened, and I don't know, we also did a universal periodic review, which is another process where you go to Geneva, and they sort of review your performance under all treaties. And by the way, John Wrights is here. He knows far more about all this stuff. This is only my experience of the way I think it works because I was participating in it, but I never read anything about this. I'm just telling you why I think I was there, why I was told I was there. But we were at the Universal Periodic Review for the United States, and I was sitting, the delegation just kind of sits intermingled with the ambassadors, and the ambassador next to me, I was at the end of the line, and so the person next to me was the ambassador from South Africa, and the ambassador from South Africa he was a white gentleman, and I think his issue was he was a big advocate for LGBTQ rights. I think he was a gay man from South Africa. And he said, "So why are you here? What's your role on this delegation?" And I said, "Well, I'm the Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs, so I'm here to answer questions about, Native Americans." And he said something like, you would have thought they would have sent an American Indian to serve that role. And I said, "Well, I am. I'm a member of the Chickasaw Nation of Oklahoma." And he said, "Well, you don't look Native American." And I said, "Well, you don't look African." So we had some fun with it, but it was really fun. I learned so much from being there, and the last time I went to the UN, and I can't remember if it was the Universal Periodic Review or the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, but I was there, and one of my buddies from law school was serving as the ambassador to the UN for human rights for the United States, first Native American ever to have an ambassadorial role like that. And we had been friends since law school, and it was a really neat position. He's, so very successful, very wealthy, and he had been involved with the campaign early on, the first term, and so he'd eventually gotten this wonderful position in government and as an ambassador in Geneva, and had an ambassador's residence and all of that. And I'd gotten to see him. He'd been in Geneva much of this time since I'd been in government, so I didn't get to see him very often. But I saw him, and he was actually heading our delegation to testify. And we were talking. We were over there for about 2 days testifying. But he said, "Hey, I'd love to see your office. When we're back over there prepping for the next day's work or something like that." And he said, "Sure, come with me. You can just ride back with me in my car to go back to the office, back to the embassy." And the embassy was about 100 yards away. We tended just to walk over, all of us together. But he had, his driver had brought him, and he had this bulletproof Cadillac, a very nice car, slightly stretched, I think, but bulletproof Cadillac. And I get in the car, I get behind the driver, he gets on the other side, and we drive up to the embassy, and the Marines salute him, and I was like, wow, that doesn't happen back at the BIA when I show up. And I've got 8,000 employees, I had a big deal job, but it wasn't like having Marines salute you when you come up. And the driver, then they run the mirror around the bottom of the car, looking underneath, making sure nobody's attached a bomb or anything. And then we drive up, and they go into the circle drive. And I get out of the car, and I walk up to the revolving door going into the embassy, and I look for Keith, the ambassador. Where is he? He was still sitting in the car waiting for the driver to come around and open the door. And I've known him since law school, right? So I tell that story every chance I get. And I give him hell about it personally all the time. Somehow he forgot how to open a car door during his time in Geneva. But it was a real privilege to be there, and to be there representing the United States with all its foibles, and to be representing the Obama administration. And it was a wonderful time. And it's really important work that happens over there. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that, President Trump also works with Indian tribes. This is the famous time when he was meeting with the code talkers, but all the press came from him calling Elizabeth Warren Pocahontas and going on and about Elizabeth Warren rather than about the Navajo code talkers who were about 100 years old and were there with him and served their country greatly. But he does work with tribes, and it's the duty of the President of the United States, and so he does work with tribes. In fact, he has recognized 7 tribes. So when I was Assistant Secretary, there were initially 566, and I recognized the 567th. Pocahontas' tribe actually had not yet been recognized, and I was able to recognize that tribe. And Congress has passed 2 laws, one of which that recognize 6 other Virginia tribes other than Pocahontas' tribes, and the Little Shell Band in Chippewa Band in Montana. The president has signed the bill. Congress recognized, and the president signed the bill. So he does do. Has taken favorable action towards tribes. Has not been as generous on the budget front as President Obama was. While we were there during the second term, which was the time, once the president was reelected for the second term, that's when President Obama could sort of do what he wished to do because he didn't have to stand for reelection again. And so when I took over, we had a $2.3 billion budget for Indian country for the BIA and the Bureau of Indian Education. And by the time I left, it was $2.8 billion, so $500 million increase, and we were requesting $2.9 billion for the next year. So that was good. President Trump's budget requests have been a little more meager than that, but it's the tribes continue to persist. That's what tribes do. They persist, and they will continue to persist. A lot of tribes will say we existed long before the United States was ever here, and we will exist long after the United States is gone. And I've always thought that was apocryphal until recently. But it's true that they've existed since long before the United States. My tribe was intermarried with, and had foreign policy long before the United States existed. So my tribe intermarried with lots of Europeans as early as the 1600s, which is why presumably I look the way I do, instead of more handsome with braids and long hair and stuff. In fact, my son is named Colbert, and he's named after a famous tribal leader from the 1860s that's my wife's great-great-great-grandfather. And but that Colbert is a Scottish name, but it's long been a Chickasaw name as well because of very, very early intermarriage. So at any rate, tribes will persist. They will continue to survive and do well, no matter who is the president, because they have persisted successfully for many, many hundreds of years, and they will continue in the future. So why don't we open it up for questions, and I'd be delighted to talk more. Thank you.
What potential is there for revival of treaties related ancestry and 2 years ago?
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
A century ago.
A century ago.
Or 2 ago.
My apologies.
Yeah. So many of the treaties actually, so the question was something like, what is the potential of us meeting the treaties of 2 centuries ago, roughly? Many of the treaties are still in effect. At least portions of them are still in effect, right? Tribes still have reservations, and most of those reservations are demarcated, many of them, not all of them, some of them are by executive order, but demarcated by treaty. And so some portions of those treaties still exist. Some of the promises made in those treaties were ill-advised and vague, I guess I would say. We will provide health care, we will provide education, forever. And what does that mean? There's a University of Minnesota campus, University of Minnesota Morris, and a school in Colorado called Fort Lewis College, and both of them have the ongoing duty to educate Native Americans for free. That was probably seemed like a sensible provision 100 years ago, but as the cost of education and everything else has gotten much more expensive, suddenly those schools are trying to think, how do we do this? And I can only imagine that plays out across every different area of activity. There aren't one of the problems with some of the provisions in the treaties. Some of them have been violated clearly, and lands taken, even though they said things like, "You will have this land as long as the grass shall grow, or as long as the rivers shall run," that sort of thing. Many of those treaties were violated. There's federal law that says that a president can violate it, or Congress can violate a treaty unilaterally without getting the consent of the tribe. I mean, so that can, that's the law. It can happen legally, in essence. Now, there may be a requirement to pay some sort of takings or something like that, compensation. But the tribes very much view their treaties as sacred, and there are some tribes that have treaties and some tribes that do not formally have treaties, but nevertheless have a relationship with the United States government and still demand a lot of services from the federal government. And if you're the federal official in charge of many of those things, you try to make sure that you're providing those services as best you can with never enough money to do so.
Are there a few areas under the UNDRIP where we could do better?
Sure. So the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, so I would say absolutely there are areas where we can do better under the UN DRIP as we call it, and it's kind of across the board almost. We've rarely fully lived up to our obligations to American Indian tribes. And one question is, if you ask tribes, what do you want? Many of them say we want our land back, and that's a hard omelet to unscramble, right? But that's ultimately what we tried to do in the Obama administration, was try to restore a lot of the lands back to tribes. Now, interestingly, the way we often did that was tribes would repurchase their lands in individual land transactions, and then we'd take that land into federal trust so that it would no longer be subject to state taxation. So it would be taken off state tax rolls so they didn't have to pay taxes on their own lands. But we didn't have a huge appropriation to go out and buy up a lot of land generally. There were limited examples of that. But that's kind of what tribes want, is ultimately they want to have a place where they are free of molestation by state laws and federal laws, and where tribes can be tribes. And tribes are, many of them are very assimilated as well, so their desires for that vary to some degree, but that's ultimately what they want, is a place to call their own and to call their home.
In K through 12 education on the reservations, how much of any attention is paid to tribal culture and language?
So a lot more than it used to be, honestly. There are tribes, there is now a situation where some tribes have significant resources, often developed themselves through gaming or even natural resources like oil and gas. And many of them have devoted a lot of those resources to schools. And I remember being on the Southern Paiute Reservation in southwestern Colorado, near Durango, Colorado, and they have a Montessori school. And the tribal chairman told me, we knew that our students knew who George Washington was, but they didn't know who our tribal leaders were and they didn't know our history. So we decided to change that to create our own schools where they learn those things. And that's a tribe that's got a lot of resources, and not all of them have that kind of resources, but there's been much more of an effort. I have to say, the things that my students are learning, even in public schools and now in Iowa City, are better than what we learned when I was in school. So even in our American public schools, we're doing a lot better around these issues, and so that's a real improvement.
Do U.S. tribes cooperate with tribes in foreign countries to create international issues for the U.S. government?
To some degree, one thing that I do have a sense of is that we actually, in the grand context of the entire world, the United States is fairly good on these issues. Canada, in some ways, is better than the United States on the way it deals with First Nations. For example, there's a constitutional provision that sort of recognizes First Nations. But First Nations would also say that they're jealous in some ways of the way American Indian tribes are treated in the United States. The sovereignty that they have on their own lands, for example, is in some ways greater than it is for the First Nations in Canada. And if you go beyond sort of Canada and New Zealand and Australia, the countries with a common heritage, the United States probably does far better than countries in South America towards their indigenous people. So, over the long term, in some ways we can be proud. We can't be super proud, but in some ways, in general, American Indian treaties are laws. And we do have a rule of law in the United States, and to some degree, tribes have been successful when they brought actions for violations of treaties, not fully and not in every respect, but we do have a system of laws that protect Indian tribes in the United States. There's actually 5 volumes of the United States Code that say Indians on the spine. It's the laws dealing with Indian tribes, and you can imagine today, my students wonder why it doesn't say Native Americans on the spine. Why does it say Indians? And it's like, well, Columbus made a mistake, and we're still living with it. But I still use that term because I'm a lawyer, and I have to pull that book off the shelf and use it. And so a lot of these statutes, like the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, it's got the name Indian, it's got the word Indian right there. So it's really the law tends to be fairly conservative, and it's kind of slow to change. But we live with a lot of, and tribes live with a lot of the weight of history on their shoulders.
So as an example would be the rights of the child. Have Native American nations signed that or any other UN regulation treaty?
Interesting. So the United Nations has not given tribes has not recognized. Oops, sorry. My phone was ringing, and I tried to turn it off. So sorry about that. I tried to turn it off by my watch. It didn't work. So what was the question? Yeah. So no, the international community has an unusual understanding of the role of tribes. So tribes are not members of the United Nations. First Nations in Canada are not members of the United Nations. They've got an interesting status, and in that forum, they've been fighting for more status. In many respects, they are treated like civil society, like organizations that care about the work that the UN does, that are good organizations. They probably deserve a higher status than that because they are sovereign governments, but they have not been able to achieve nation-state status in the United Nations, and they would like that, and they have sought it. And so they're battling on many fronts. They're battling the United States for status, and they're battling the UN for status, and the whole international community to some degree. And it's controversial and fraught because some of these, like I said, countries in South America or Central America that don't necessarily want to recognize indigenous nations, those countries have to be convinced and to vote in favor of something like that. So it's complicated.
All right. So what is your opinion on current Indian gaming policy? Mm-hmm.
So as I was, I mentioned the funding that I had in Washington. So I mentioned. Oh no, it's okay. It's okay. So what is my opinion about Indian gaming? And so, Just to put things in perspective, I mentioned the budget that I had to serve the BIA and the BIE, which ultimately was about $2.8 billion when I left the federal government. Indian gaming brings about $30 billion a year to Indian country, 10 times what the federal government provides. And so I actually had one senator briefly hold up my confirmation, and the senator, it was Dianne Feinstein, and she said, "I hate Indian gaming. You know, I just don't like it. I don't like it in my communities. We don't want it in our backyard, and I want you to tell me that you're against Indian gaming." And I said, "Senator, Indian gaming is really, it's the only thing that's really worked well as economic development in Indian country, so I can't tell you I'm against Indian gaming. My job, if you put me in this position, is to advocate for Indian gaming." And she said, "Well, I won't support you then." I was like, well, that was one senator, and unfortunately in the U.S. Senate, you have to have unanimous consent for virtually anything to move, so you need all 100 of them, really, for most things. But we worked on her and said, that's just unrealistic. If any assistant secretary in a Democrat administration comes in and tells you they're against Indian gaming, they're lying, because their job is to support what's good for tribes. And so she ultimately relented, and I was unanimously confirmed by the Senate in actually fairly short order. But Indian gaming turns out to be really important for tribes because of all of that money. Indian tribes, the American governmental system is highly corrupt, right? Money has a big impact in it, and some small number of tribes now have a little bit of money to participate in that corruption like other American corporations and other groups have, and they need that, right? You have to use, money is important in the United States. It's not everything. E.g. Mayor Mike Bloomberg, right? Money is not everything. It can't buy everything, but money turns out to be exceedingly important in the United States in the political process. And so it's very good that tribes are able to deploy money in similar ways in Washington, D.C. And interestingly, there's real haves and have-nots in Indian country now because there are some very small tribes that have lots of resources. And all the big tribes are just as poor as they've always been, honestly. The poverty in the Indian country is still the worst poverty anywhere in the United States, especially, for example, in South Dakota. But to their credit, some of the wealthier tribes, some of the tribes that do have resources, they sort of, help the other tribes. They don't have any duty to those other tribes. They don't owe, the tribes in Connecticut or in Florida or somewhere else don't have any duty. They don't owe anything to the Lakota tribes in South Dakota. But as a practical matter, they work on similar issues together. They work on the Indian Child Welfare Act when it's in Congress and that sort of thing. And so they work together on a lot of those issues. So it's very good that there are some tribes that have significant resources. It would be great if those resources were distributed more broadly, but I'm grateful for those wealthy tribes that have the resources to be able to fight for all of Indian country in Washington, D.C. and on Capitol Hill. They do a good thing. So I'm very much in favor of Indian gaming. My own tribe has benefited tremendously. I will tell one little anecdote along those lines. This is a question I get a lot, and once I start talking about it, the answer is kind of obvious, but it's a question. Is Indian gaming really good for tribes? I get that question a lot, and after I stepped down from the Obama administration, my tribe wanted to put me into the Chickasaw Hall of Fame. They elect 2 or 3 people every year to our tribe's Hall of Fame. We've got a museum in Oklahoma paid for by gaming revenues, and I said, I can't do it. I'm scheduled to go to Australia to speak at the University of Monash in Melbourne, and I just can't make it work because I got to basically, leave the next day. It just doesn't work for me. Thank you so much for honoring me, but I can't make it then. And they said, well, what do you mean if it's not an actual conflict? And I said, well, I've got a conference that I've got to go to and give a talk in Palm Springs and then go right to LAX and fly to Australia. And they said, but the conference isn't until the next day. And I said, that's true. And they said, well, we can get you from Oklahoma to Palm Springs, early the next morning. And I was like, well, I looked at the flights. There aren't any flights. And they said, no, we can put you on the Learjet, the tribal Learjet, and we can get you there. And I said, well, I've got my family traveling with me, my kids and my mother-in-law, and, it's, and they said, no problem. It doesn't cost any more for another couple of people to be on the Learjet. And they said that, the Chickasaw Air Force will take you from Oklahoma to Palm Springs. And, these questions, it's often when I'm sitting on an airplane and the nice person sitting next to me in the seat asks me what I do, and I talk about it, and they say, well, is Indian gaming really good for tribes? So as we were landing in Palm Springs, I turned to my then like 15-year-old son, and I said, this is really great. This is a nice way to travel by Learjet. And I said, it's also really nice not having that really earnest person in the middle seat saying, is Indian gaming really good for tribes? You're damn right it is. Anyway, thank you so much for having me. This has been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much, Kevin. That was absolutely wonderful. I also want to thank our sponsors, the University of Iowa's Honors Program, the University of Iowa Public Policy Center, and the Stanley UI Foundation Support Organization for their generous support. And we also thank today's special sponsor, an anonymous donation in honor of Ed Zastro. Now, also, we thank City Channel 4 for making our programs available to viewing audiences. And Kevin, as a small token of our appreciation, we would like to present you with the highly coveted Iowa City Foreign Relations Council mug.
I'm deeply honored.
Thank you. We are adjourned. Thank you, everyone.